The wind tasted of iron and distance. It was the first thing Abigail Dawson noticed as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her boots sinking into the fine red dust that coated everything in Bitter Creek. The town was less a town and more a raw nerve stretched along a set of wagon ruts. False-fronted buildings, their pine boards thirsty for paint, leaned against one another for support. A saloon's doors flapped open and shut, releasing bursts of stale beer and argument into the dry air. Above it all, a single iron wire, thin and new, hummed a high, taut note as it sliced across the Wyoming sky, a promise of news and trouble arriving at the same speed. Abigail clutched the handle of her father's medical bag. The leather was worn smooth where his hand had held it for 30 years, and it felt like the only solid thing in this restless landscape. She had come here from Chicago, a city of stone and certainty, chasing the one thing that place would not grant her the freedom to practice her trade without being looked upon as a novelty or a mistake. Here, she thought, a person's worth might be measured by their hands, not by the cut of their clothes. A man stood in the scant shade of the livery stable, watching the stagecoach with an unnerving stillness. He was tall and lean, built of long muscle and bone. He wore denim trousers and a plain cotton shirt. Common enough, but his hair was long and black, tied back with a leather thong, and the planes of his face were all sharp angles and Lakota ancestry. He met her gaze for a moment, his eyes dark and unreadable, before nodding once, a gesture of acknowledgement so subtle it was almost lost in the shimmering heat. This, she surmised, was Thomas Running Bear, the man the stage driver had mentioned. He was the town's informal peacekeeper, a man who walked between two worlds and was fully welcome in neither. He kept order not with a badge, but with a quiet presence that discouraged foolishness. The blacksmith, a broad man named Hector, was hammering a rhythm of metal on metal, the sound a steady heartbeat for the town. His young son, Miguel, played near the smithy door, chasing a lizard with a stick. Life in Bitter Creek felt fragile but persistent, like the hardy scrub brush that clung to the dry earth. Then the world became a fist of sound and heat. A roar erupted from the blacksmith's shop, a violent guttural blast that shattered windows up and down the street. The smithy's small side shed, where powder and oils were kept, vanished in a bloom of orange fire and black smoke. The force of it threw Hector back against an anvil and sent splinters of wood scything through the air. The humming telegraph wire above seemed to shriek in protest. For a heartbeat, the town froze. Men spilled out of the saloon, their faces slack with shock. Horses screamed in their stalls. The red dust, unsettled by the blast, swirled in a thick, choking cloud. Abigail did not freeze. The scent of sulfur and burned tar hit her, and her training took over. Through the roiling smoke, she saw a small shape on the ground. Miguel. He was not moving. She ran. Her hat flew from her head, and the pins scattered from her hair, but she did not notice. She heard a man shout for her to stop, that it was too dangerous, but the voice was just another sound in the chaos. Her world had narrowed to the boy and the bag in her hand. Flames licked at the main doors of the smithy, greedily consuming the dry wood. As Abigail reached Miguel, another figure moved through the smoke with purpose. It was Thomas Running Bear. He carried 2 heavy horse blankets soaked with water from the trough. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers again. And in that instant, there was a shared understanding. He would fight the fire. She would fight for the boy's life. She knelt in the dirt, her clean traveling dress instantly ruined. Miguel was unconscious, a long, ugly gash on his forehead, weeping blood into the dust. His breathing was shallow, a faint flutter in his small chest, with practiced fingers. She checked his pulse, tilting his head back to clear his airway. She opened her father's bag. The familiar click of the brass latches a small point of order in the madness. Gauze, carbolic acid, bandages. Her hands moved with an economy that belied the panic clawing at the edges of her mind. Behind her, She was aware of Thomas smothering the flames, his movements efficient and powerful. He beat back the fire with the wet blankets, a focused, desperate battle against the blaze. Other men, shaken from their stupor, now ran forward with buckets, their initial shock giving way to a frantic energy. Abigail cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. A piece of shrapnel, a wicked sliver of metal, was embedded in the boy's arm, just below the shoulder. It would have to come out. She looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd that had begun to form a circle around her. She saw Hector, the blacksmith, stumbling toward them, his face a mask of anguish as he cried out his son's name. She called out for clean water and boiled linen, if any could be found. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the noise. It was the voice of a doctor, a voice of command. A stout, gray-haired woman bustled forward from the crowd. It was Mrs. Eldridge, the apothecary owner. She told Abigail she had what was needed at her shop and hurried away. The crowd murmured, a low rumble of disbelief and suspicion. They stared at Abigail, at her unbound hair falling around her shoulders, at her hands, stained with blood and dust, working on the boy. The sheriff, a portly man with a drooping mustache named Abernathy, pushed his way through. He looked from Abigail to the boy and back again. He asked what in God's name she thought she was doing. He said they had already sent for the doctor from Cheyenne, though he was a day's ride away. Abigail did not look up from her work. She informed him that a doctor was already here. Abernathy scoffed. He said they needed a real doctor, not a woman playing nurse. He told her to step aside before she did more harm. The sentiment rippled through the onlookers. A woman doctor. It was unnatural. It was absurd. Thomas had contained the worst of the fire. He walked over, his face smudged with soot, the smell of smoke clinging to him. He stood beside Abigail, a silent sentinel. He looked at Sheriff Abernathy, his expression flat. He told the sheriff that he had seen her work. He said she knew what she was doing. He suggested, in a quiet voice that carried more weight than a shout, that everyone give her space. The sheriff sputtered, but the certainty in Thomas's voice, and the simple fact that this woman had been the only one to act, gave the crowd pause. The seeds of trust and doubt were sown in the same dusty patch of ground. Mrs. Eldridge returned with a kettle of steaming water and clean cloths. Abigail thanked her and immediately set to sterilizing a probe and forceps. With the utmost care, she worked the metal shard from Miguel's arm. The boy moaned but did not wake. She stitched the gash on his forehead with the neat, precise sutures. Her movements a testament to years of study and practice. She wrapped the wounds, her hands a blur of competence. Finally, she rose, her back aching, her knees stiff. She instructed Hector, who was now kneeling beside his son, on how to watch his breathing and keep the wounds clean. She promised to check on him again in an hour. The town watched this exchange in silence. They had just witnessed something impossible, and they did not know what to make of it. A man stepped out from the crowd, separating himself from the dusty, sweat-stained onlookers. He was dressed in a fine coat and polished boots that seemed to repel the grime of Bitter Creek. His face was clean-shaven, his eyes a pale, cold blue. He moved with an air of absolute authority, as if the ground he walked on had already been purchased and paid for. This was Silas Griggs, the man who owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory and was financing the new railroad spur and telegraph line. He was the architect of Bitter Creek's future, and he made sure everyone knew it. He smiled, a thin, dry affair that did not reach his eyes. He approached Abigail. Removing his hat, he commended her for her quick thinking. He called it a fine display of civic duty. Then he reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. He said he would be happy to compensate her for her trouble. He felt it was his responsibility, as the town's primary investor, to ensure such incidents were handled smoothly. Abigail looked at the money he offered. Then back at his face. She saw the calculation in his eyes. This was not a payment. It was a retainer. She thanked him for the offer, but said it was not necessary. She explained that she was a doctor, and helping the boy was her responsibility, not a service for hire. Griggs's smile tightened at the edges. He insisted, saying that everyone in Bitter Creek who worked did so for a wage, and he liked to ensure people were paid what they were worth, provided they understood who was signing the check. He continued that a person in her position could do very well here, as long as she was cooperative and recognized how business was done. His railroad and his cattle operation, he explained, were delicate things. They did not respond well to interference, medical or otherwise. The implication hung in the air, as thick as the smoke. Abigail met his cold gaze without flinching. She replied politely that her only business was medicine, and that her only concern was the well-being of her patients. She hoped that would not conflict with his enterprises. A flicker of annoyance crossed Griggs's face before being smoothed away. He put his wallet back in his coat. He told her that was a respectable position to take. For now, he put his hat back on, the gesture a clear dismissal. He turned his attention to the smoldering ruin of the shed. He announced to the sheriff that he found the timing of this explosion mighty convenient, what with his survey team for the new telegraph line arriving next week. He said it smelled like sabotage to him. He wondered aloud if perhaps someone was trying to send a message, someone who did not appreciate progress. As he spoke, his pale blue eyes settled on Thomas Running Bear. The accusation was unspoken, but it was as clear as the ringing of a hammer on an anvil. The people of Bitter Creek looked from Griggs to Thomas, and the fragile trust that had begun to form around the Lakota man started to fray. The explosion was no longer just an accident. It was a fuse, newly lit, and no one knew how long it would burn. The telegraph wire overhead hummed its ceaseless, metallic song. The dust from the explosion settled, but the town's unease did not. Talk of Abigail Dawson became the main currency in Bitter Creek, traded over saloon bars and across general store counters. She was the woman who ran toward fire. She was the woman who stitched up the blacksmith's boy with hands as steady as a surgeon's. But she was still a woman, and that fact stuck in the craw of many like a stubborn bit of gristle. For a price, Mrs. Eldridge had rented Abigail a small back room in her apothecary, which now served as a makeshift clinic. It smelled of dried herbs and carbolic soap, a clean, sharp scent that was a world away from the street's ever-present odor of dust and horse. A few days later, the saloon doors burst open again, not with the usual swagger of a drunken cowboy, but with the frantic energy of real trouble. Two ranch hands carried a third between them, a young man named Billy Morrison. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his leg bent at an angle that defied nature. His father, Jake Morrison, a rancher whose face was a road map of sun and worry, followed close behind, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. They brought him straight to the apothecary. A horse had fallen on him, they said, and the bone was sticking out. The small crowd that gathered at the door was a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern. They laid Billy on the sturdy wooden table Abigail used for examinations. The sight was grim. A shard of white bone, jagged and sharp, had torn through his denim trousers and skin. The wound already caked with dirt and blood. Abigail's focus narrowed, the murmuring of the onlookers fading into a distant hum. She washed her hands thoroughly in a basin, the simple act a ritual of preparation. She needed whiskey for the patient and for her instruments, clean cloth, hot water, and all the splinting material misses Eldridge could find. As supplies were gathered, the cowboys who had carried Billy in grew restless. One of them, smelling of cheap liquor, swayed on his feet and declared that they ought to just saw the leg off and be done with it. He said it was better than letting a woman poke at it. A quiet presence filled the doorway. Thomas Running Bear had appeared as if from the earth itself. He did not look at the loudmouth cowboy. He looked at Jake Morrison. He said that the boy had a chance to keep his leg. He suggested that making noise would not help. His voice was low and even, yet it cut through the nervous tension like a sharp knife. The cowboys fell silent, shuffling their feet and suddenly finding great interest in the floorboards. Thomas remained at the door, his arms crossed, a silent guarantee of order. Abigail worked. She poured whiskey over the wound, eliciting a sharp hiss of pain from Billy, who was now biting down on a leather strap. She cleaned the area with a fierce concentration, picking out fragments of dirt and cloth. This was the part that mattered most, the part that so many frontier doctors ignored. Infection, not the break itself, was the real killer. She spoke to Jake Morrison, her voice calm and direct, explaining what she was doing. She told him that she would need to set the bone, and it would be unpleasant. She had him and one of his men hold Billy's shoulders, while she took the boy's foot in her hands. The feeling of bone grinding as she pulled, firmly and steadily, was a terrible, intimate thing. Billy screamed against the leather, his body arching in agony. Abigail's jaw was tight, her own muscles straining with the effort. Then came the clean, solid click as the bone slipped back into alignment. The worst was over. Now came the science. She showed Mrs. Eldridge how to mix a paste of plaster of Paris, a fine white powder that felt like hope. While it was being prepared, she sutured the torn flesh. Jake Morrison watched her needle dip and rise, his expression a mixture of awe and deep-seated skepticism. He asked her gruffly where a woman learned to sew up a man like that. Abigail did not miss a stitch. She replied without looking up, asking him if he had ever tried sewing a buffalo hide. Then he should imagine how much easier a man's skin was in comparison. A dry chuckle escaped one of the cowboys before he stifled it. She wrapped the leg in soft linen and then began applying the wet plaster bandages, smoothing them into a hard, protective shell. The process was methodical, almost sculptural. When she was finished, Billy's leg was encased in a flawless white cast, a stark contrast to the grime and blood of moments before. She left instructions for Jake on how to care for his son, how to watch for fever, and when she would come out to the ranch to check on him. Jake Morrison nodded, his gruff demeanor softened by a profound relief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag of coins. He counted out a sum and held it out to her. It was a decent amount of money, but Abigail knew, from conversations with Mrs. Eldridge about the going rates, that it was exactly half of what Dr. Miller from Cheyenne would have charged. She looked at the coins in his hand, then at his face. She did not take the money. Jake cleared his throat. He said it was good work. For a woman, he figured that was a fair price. Before Abigail could speak, Thomas pushed himself off the doorframe. He took a single step into the room. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "The boy has his leg. Morrison." The statement hung in the air, plain and heavy. It was not a threat, but a simple summary of the transaction. The value was not in the gender of the doctor, but in the result. The leg was saved. Abigail took a small ledger from a nearby shelf. She opened it and, with a pencil, wrote down the date and the patient's name in a clear, steady hand. She listed the services rendered: emergency consultation, cleaning and debridement of a compound fracture, surgical reduction of the tibia, 20 sutures, and application of a full plaster cast. Beside each item, she listed a cost for the materials used: the carbolic acid, the gut for stitching, the plaster, the linen. At the bottom, she drew a line and wrote the total. It was precisely double what Jake Morrison had offered. She turned the ledger toward him. She said, "This is my bill. My fee is for my skill and my supplies, not my gender. You are paying for the procedure, not the person. If you feel the procedure was unsatisfactory, we can discuss a reduction." Jake Morrison looked at the ledger. He looked at his son, sleeping from exhaustion, his leg whole and protected. He looked at Thomas, whose dark eyes revealed nothing. He looked at Abigail, whose expression was not angry, but as cool and professional as the bill she had written. A slow, dark flush crept up his neck. He reached back into his pocket, his movements stiff, and counted out the remaining coins onto the table. He did not meet her eyes. He mumbled his thanks and organized his men to carry his son out. As they left, a quiet respect settled in the room, more tangible than the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. But outside, the whispers began. The woman doctor and the Lakota man. They made a strange pair. They were upsetting the natural order of things, the rough but predictable justice of Bitter Creek. Silas Griggs heard the story. Of course, he heard it from the telegraph operator, who missed nothing. He saw the way people were starting to look at Abigail with a grudging admiration, and the way they deferred to Thomas's quiet authority. He did not like it. Order in his town was something he cultivated and controlled. This new alliance, based on competence and mutual respect, was a weed in his garden. Later that week, a message clicked and chattered over the telegraph wire from the territorial capital in Cheyenne. The operator, a young man with ink-stained fingers, scribbled it down. It was an official bulletin for all apothecaries and doctors in the region. A shipment of arsenic had gone missing from a freight wagon somewhere on the trail. It was a large quantity, enough to poison a town's water supply. The bulletin urged caution. The operator was about to post the notice on the public board when Silas Griggs entered the office to send a message of his own. He glanced at the bulletin in the young man's hand. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He told the operator that there was no need to cause a panic. He said that sort of news would only make people nervous and flighty. He was sure the shipment was simply misplaced and would turn up. He suggested, with the casual authority of a man who owned the operator's next paycheck, that it would be best if that particular message remained private. He would handle it. The operator, wanting no trouble, folded the paper and tucked it away. The warning never reached Mrs. Eldridge or Abigail. The news of the missing poison was swallowed by the silence. And outside, the Wyoming wind continued its low, mournful song along the humming wire. The sickness began in the one-room schoolhouse, a place of shared slates and shared air. It started as a sore throat in one of the younger girls, then a fever and a rash that spread like a blush across her chest. The teacher, a stern woman with a kind heart, sent her home. The next day, 3 more children were sick. By the end of the week, scarlet fever had Bitter Creek in its grip. Fear, a more virulent contagion than any germ, spread faster. It shuttered windows and emptied the saloon. The humming telegraph wire, once a symbol of connection, now seemed to thrum with a more sinister energy, carrying whispers of a divine punishment or a bad omen. For Abigail Dawson, the world shrank to the 4 walls of her clinic and the sick rooms of the small, terrified town. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford. For 72 hours, she moved like a ghost through the dusty streets, her father's medical bag a constant weight in her hand. She dispensed what little medicine she had, but her most potent tools were clean water, cool cloths, and calm, steady reassurance. She enforced a brutal regimen of hygiene, insisting on boiled linens and scrubbed hands, a gospel of cleanliness that was met with suspicion but, in the face of mounting death, grudgingly followed. She was not alone. As panic began to curdle the town's courage, Thomas Running Bear became a bulwark against the chaos. He seemed to be everywhere at once. He organized a small group to haul fresh water from a clean upstream source, bypassing the town's communal well. He stood guard at the doors of quarantined houses, not with a weapon, but with a quiet resolve that was more effective than any lock. When a group of cowboys, drunk and defiant, tried to force their way into the saloon for a gathering, Thomas met them at the doors. He did not threaten them. He spoke to them in a low voice, reminding them of their own families, of the small graves already being dug on the hill. They grumbled, but they dispersed. He and Abigail worked in a silent, seamless partnership, 2 solitary figures fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the fever, the other against the fear. On the third night, exhaustion finally claimed its due. Abigail was in her clinic, cleaning her instruments by the low light of a kerosene lamp, when the world began to tilt. The flame blurred, and a chill that had nothing to do with the night air sank deep into her bones. Her head pounded in time with the frantic beat of her own heart. She tried to stand, to get a drink of water, but her legs buckled. She crumpled to the floor. The clatter of a falling basin, the last sound she heard before the darkness took her. It was Thomas who found her. He had come to bring her a small portion of broth Mrs. Eldridge had made, knowing the doctor would forget to eat. He saw her through the window, a still form on the floorboards, and entered without knocking. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to the small cot in the corner of the room. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing ragged. The telltale rash was beginning to bloom across her neck. He knew the signs. He had seen this sickness before. He did not panic. He moved with the same deliberate purpose he brought to everything. He stoked the small stove, put a kettle on to boil, and found a clean cloth. He worked in the dim lamplight, his large frame casting long shadows on the walls. He went out into the night and returned a short time later with a handful of willow bark, which he shaved into the kettle. The sharp, earthy scent of the brewing tea filled the small room. Abigail drifted in and out of a fevered haze. At one point, she opened her eyes and saw him sitting on a stool beside her cot, wiping her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. His touch was incredibly gentle. In her delirium, she could not separate reality from dream. She murmured something, her voice a dry rasp. She was back in medical school in Chicago, surrounded by professors who questioned her presence, by fellow students who saw her as an intrusion. "They do not see a doctor," she whispered, the words tumbling out, fever-slicked and raw. "They only see a woman." Thomas leaned closer. He continued to bathe her face with the cloth. His own mother. He said, his voice a low rumble, had been a healer. She knew the old Lakota ways. Which plants could soothe a fever, which roots could stop a bleeding. The white doctor in the town where she lived had called her practice savage superstition. Yet, Thomas said, the same people who scorned her in public would come to their back door at night, desperate for her remedies when the doctor's bottled medicines failed them. She lived between two worlds, he said, and was a ghost in both. Abigail's eyes, clouded with fever, focused on his face. She saw the history of his words etched there, the quiet pain of a life spent on the outside looking in. She felt a profound connection to this man, a shared loneliness that transcended the space between her cot and his stool. She reached out a trembling hand. He took it. His hand was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. He held it not with passion, but with a simple, grounding solidarity. He was an anchor in her fever-tossed sea. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, she slept. Her fever broke the next morning. She woke feeling weak and hollowed out, but clear-headed. The first thing she saw was Thomas, asleep in the stool, his head resting against the wall, her hand still held loosely in his. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a long moment, she just watched him, this quiet, steadfast man who had cared for her without question. The town, however, had questions. News of the doctor's illness had spread, but so had the news of her caretaker. Tongues wagged over backyard fences and in the general store. Mrs. Eldridge staunchly defended them both, her face set in a look of fierce disapproval at any who dared whisper a malicious word. But the sight of Thomas Running Bear leaving the apothecary in the early morning light was enough to confirm the worst suspicions for some. The town was divided. Half saw two decent people helping each other through a crisis. The other half saw a breach of propriety, a scandalous alliance between a fallen woman and a man they did not trust. The telegraph wire hummed with this new gossip, carrying it to the outlying ranches, the story twisting and darkening with every mile it traveled. When Abigail was strong enough to walk again, Silas Griggs paid her a visit. He did not come to her clinic. He requested her presence in his office at the new railroad depot, a place of business and power. He was polite, offering her a seat and a glass of water. He told her he admired her fortitude. He said the town owed her a debt of gratitude for her handling of the epidemic. Then his tone shifted, the polished veneer of civility thinning to reveal the hard grain of business beneath. He said an epidemic was bad for a town's reputation, bad for investment. He said the rumors now circulating about her and the Lakota man were also destabilizing. People needed to feel a sense of order, of predictability. He leaned forward, his pale eyes pinning her to the chair. He could provide that order. He could put a stop to the gossip. He could ensure a steady supply of medicine and equipment for her clinic, things that were often hard to come by. He could, he said, offer her his protection. The town would respect a doctor who worked for Silas Griggs. No one would dare question her. All she had to do was be sensible. All she had to do was remember who was responsible for the town's prosperity. Abigail looked at him, at his expensive coat and his confident smile. She understood the offer perfectly. It was not protection he was offering. It was a gilded cage. He wanted to own her competence, to turn her healing into just another one of his assets. She stood up, her legs still a bit unsteady, but her voice was firm. She thanked him for his concern. She said she believed her work would speak for itself. And as for her personal affairs, she said they were just that, personal. She would not trade her independence for his approval. Silas Griggs' smile did not falter, but a coldness settled in his eyes. He told her that was a pity. Independence, he said, was a lonely and expensive thing to maintain in a town like Bitter Creek. The fever had passed, but it left behind a town brittle and suspicious. The quiet that had fallen over Bitter Creek during the sickness was replaced by a low, simmering tension that sought any excuse to boil over. It found one on a Saturday night in the saloon. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and the kind of male desperation that festers over a losing hand of poker. An argument, ugly and slurred, erupted from a corner table. A rail-thin cowboy accused a burly mule skinner of dealing from the bottom of the deck. Accusations became shoves, and shoves became the sharp, deafening crack of a pistol. The mule skinner slumped over the table, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. For a moment, the saloon was a frozen tableau of shock. Then came the panic. Men scrambled for the doors, overturning tables and chairs in their haste. The gunshot, a raw tear in the fabric of the night, reached the back room of the apothecary where Abigail was reading by lamplight. She was on her feet before the echo died, her medical bag already in her hand. When she reached the saloon, Thomas was already there. He seemed to materialize in moments of crisis, a calm center in the swirling chaos. He was not looking at the wounded man. He was watching the crowd. His presence a silent command that kept the panic from turning into a stampede. He met Abigail's eyes and gave a slight nod toward the corner table. Together, they moved through the wreckage. He cleared a space for her, pushing a broken table aside, his movements economical and sure. Abigail knelt beside the mule skinner. The man was alive, his breathing a wet, shallow gurgle. The bullet had entered his side, and she knew without looking that it had likely torn through a lung. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady in the flickering lamplight. She packed the wound to slow the bleeding, her mind a quiet, focused engine of diagnosis and procedure. Thomas stood over her, a shield against the frightened, whispering onlookers. He procured clean rags and whiskey from the stunned bartender, anticipating her needs without a word being spoken. They were a team, moving in a rhythm born of shared purpose. They had saved the man, for now, getting him stable enough to endure the painful journey to a real hospital. As they worked, the town watched. They saw a woman's hands, stained with blood, working with a skill that was undeniable, and they saw the Lakota man who stood with her. His quiet strength an inseparable part of the strange, effective partnership that was changing the very nature of their town. The true test did not come with the roar of a gun, but with a frantic, desperate knocking in the dead of night. A storm was brewing, the wind howling around the corners of the buildings, rattling the window panes. Abigail opened her door to find John Sullivan, a farmer from a small homestead a few miles out of town. His face was a mess of rain and fear. It was his wife, Mary. The baby was coming. But it was all wrong. Abigail gathered her bag. The urgency in the man's voice told her there was no time to waste. As she stepped out into the wind, she saw Thomas emerge from the shadows of the livery stable. He had heard the commotion. He held a lit lantern, its yellow glow pushing back against the oppressive dark. He did not ask if she needed him. He simply fell into step beside her, his long strides easily keeping pace with Sullivan's frantic scramble toward his wagon. The ride to the farm was a battle against the elements. Rain lashed down, turning the wagon ruts into thick, clinging mud. The wind tore at them, a living thing that wanted to drive them back. When they finally reached the small, sod-roofed house, the storm was at its peak. Inside, the air was hot and still. Mary Sullivan lay on the bed, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her body trembling with exhaustion. A single glance told Abigail the situation was dire. The baby was coming feet first, a breech birth that was one of the most dangerous complications a woman could face. It required strength, skill, and more than one pair of hands. She turned to give instructions to both John and Thomas, but the farmer was staring at Thomas, who stood just inside the doorway, his silhouette framed by the raging storm. Sullivan's fear for his wife was now hopelessly tangled with another. Older fear, the fear of his neighbors, of their judgment, of what was proper. He told Abigail he did not want that man in his house. His voice was a choked whisper, but it was absolute. It was not right, he said, not with his wife in this state. He looked at Thomas with a wild, terrified desperation, as if the Lakota man's very presence was a contamination. Abigail started to argue. She told him she needed help, that Mary's life and the baby's life were at stake. But Thomas understood before she did. He saw that the farmer's terror was not something that could be reasoned with. It was a deep, unthinking prejudice, made stronger by panic. He looked at Abigail, and in his eyes she saw a profound sadness, a weary acceptance of a familiar boundary. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of support. And then he stepped back outside, closing the door behind him, leaving Abigail alone with the Sullivans and the storm. For the next 2 hours, Abigail fought. She fought against the baby's unnatural position, her muscles straining, her arms aching with the effort of turning the child in the womb. She fought against Mary's exhaustion and John's helpless, hovering panic. She fought against her own fatigue, her mind a steel trap of medical knowledge and sheer, stubborn will. The wind howled outside, a counterpoint to Mary's cries of pain. And through it all, Abigail was aware of the man on the porch, waiting in the storm, a silent partner in a struggle he was not allowed to join. At last, just before dawn, she succeeded. The cry of a healthy newborn cut through the sound of the wind and rain. A baby boy. Mary was weeping with relief, and John Sullivan was on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He looked at Abigail, his eyes full of a gratitude so immense it left him speechless. He also looked at her with a deep, burning shame. When Abigail finally stepped out onto the porch, the storm had passed. The air was cool and clean. Thomas was sitting on the top step, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as she emerged, his face unreadable. He did not ask what had happened. He knew. He simply stood, took her heavy bag from her hand, and began the long walk back to town. The sun was rising as they arrived. A crowd was already gathering in the street near the apothecary. Some of them, mostly women, rushed forward as they saw her. They carried small offerings, a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of milk. Their faces were full of wonder and respect. They had heard, The news of the miracle at the Sullivan farm had already spread, but others stood apart. They watched her with cold, narrowed eyes. They had also heard the other story, the one whispered with a sneer. They had heard that Thomas Running Bear had spent the entire night at the Sullivan place. They saw him now, walking at the doctor's side. And in their minds, the heroic narrative was twisted into something sordid and shameful. Abigail felt their judgment like a physical blow, a cold slap of reality after the night's hard-won victory. She was proud, but she was also profoundly alone. Later that day, Thomas came to her clinic. He did not waste time with small talk. He told her he was leaving Bitter Creek. He had seen the way people looked at her. He had heard the whispers that followed them both like a stray dog. His presence, he said, was a stone tied around her neck. It gave the town an excuse to deny her the respect she had earned 10 times over. As long as he was here, she would never just be the doctor. She would always be the woman who kept company with him. Abigail wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong, to say that she did not care what they thought. But the words died in her throat. She knew he was right. The town's prejudice was a wall she could not seem to break through, and he was the part of that wall they focused on. He told her he would go to the Wind River Reservation. He had family there. He said a man like him might be able to do some good, to walk between his own people and the white authorities. His departure was a sacrifice, a quiet, painful act of loyalty. He was giving up his place in this town so that she could claim hers. He turned and walked out, leaving an emptiness in the small room that felt larger and more desolate than the entire Wyoming territory. That same afternoon, Mrs. Eldridge was in the mercantile, buying thread. Silas Griggs was at the counter, speaking in a low, confidential tone to his ranch foreman. He paid no mind to the gray-haired woman inspecting spools of cotton. Mrs. Eldridge was not trying to listen, but she could not help but overhear fragments of their conversation. She heard the words "new telegraph line." She heard "a straight line saves a week of work." And then, chillingly, she heard Griggs say that the old burial grounds in the valley were just patches of dirt, and that no one would raise a fuss that mattered. Mrs. Eldridge froze, her hand hovering over a spool of blue thread. She understood at once. Griggs was not just building a telegraph line. He was planning to plow it straight through a sacred Lakota valley, a place of ancestors, for the simple reason that it was the cheapest route. He was not just a greedy man. He was a man who would light a fire to warm his hands, even if it meant burning down the whole world. She paid for her thread, her mind racing. The small, petty dramas of Bitter Creek were nothing. A real storm was coming. The silence Thomas Running Bear left behind was a physical presence in Bitter Creek. It settled in the dust, echoed in the space he used to occupy near the livery, and made the town feel smaller, meaner. Abigail Dawson felt his absence as a constant, low ache. She continued her work, tending to the lingering coughs from the fever and the everyday injuries of a hardscrabble life. But the town's gratitude was a thin, brittle thing. The glances she received were still laced with suspicion. The respect she was given felt conditional, temporary. She was useful, but she was not welcome. The words, Mrs. Eldridge had whispered to her about Silas Griggs's plan for the new telegraph line became a burr under her saddle. The casual cruelty of running a wire through a sacred burial ground, simply because it was the cheapest path, spoke of a rot that went deeper than prejudice. It was a cold, calculating disregard for humanity itself. One evening, by the light of her lamp, she pulled out a clean sheet of paper. With a steady hand, she composed a letter. It was addressed to the federal Indian agent at the Wind River Reservation. She introduced herself as Dr. Abigail Dawson. Formerly of Chicago, she detailed her training and her experience, including her recent work during the scarlet fever outbreak. She wrote that she understood the reservation was in need of a resident physician and formally offered her services. She did not mention Thomas. She did not write of her loneliness or her disgust with Bitter Creek. She wrote only of medicine, of skill, of need. The letter was a purely professional document, an act of self-determination. She was not following a man. She was seeking a post where she could be a doctor, whole and complete. She gave the sealed envelope to the stagecoach driver the next morning with a coin for its passage. Weeks crawled by. No reply came. The Wyoming autumn began to bleed the green from the prairie, leaving it a sea of gold and brown. The wind sharpened, carrying the first hints of winter. The quiet hostility of the town wore on Abigail, a slow erosion of her spirit. She had won their respect in moments of crisis, but she could not seem to earn their simple acceptance in the quiet days between. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to the inevitable. She would not wait for a letter that might never arrive. She would not stay in a place that saw her as half of a scandal instead of a whole person. She spent 2 full days preparing to leave. She did not pack her own belongings. Instead, she sat at her small table and wrote. For every patient she had treated, she created a detailed file. She wrote of Miguel's recovery from the explosion, noting the clean healing of his wounds. She documented the precise way she had set Billy Morrison's leg, with diagrams showing the nature of the break and notes on his progress. She compiled her observations from the fever epidemic, listing symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. It was her duty, a final act of service to a town that did not deserve it, but that she could not bring herself to abandon completely. She made 3 neat copies of the entire record, bundled them, and arranged for them to be delivered to the 3 nearest doctors in the territory, ensuring a continuity of care. Her work in Bitter Creek would have a life beyond her presence there. On the morning of her departure, the news of it had finally spread. She was loading the last of her things into a sturdy wagon she had purchased when a small group of men approached her. Their boots shuffled awkwardly in the dust. It was Jake Morrison, his son's leg now healing cleanly in its cast. It was John Sullivan, the farmer whose son she had delivered from the heart of a storm. And it was the town pastor, a man who had offered her platitudes but little real support. Jake Morrison spoke first, his hat held crushed in his hands. He said, "Doctor, that is, the town, we would be obliged if you would reconsider. My boy, he would have lost his leg." John Sullivan nodded vigorously. "My Mary, and our son, we owe you everything. You cannot just leave. We need you." The pastor stepped forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "My child," he said, "this community needs a healer. It would be a disservice to your God-given talents to abandon these good people." Abigail stopped her work. She turned to face them, her expression calm, her eyes clear. She looked at each of them in turn, seeing not malice, but a profound and willful blindness. She said, "You are correct. You do need a doctor." She let the words hang in the air for a moment. "But what you have not yet learned is how to accept the person who holds that title. You want my skill in a crisis, but you scorn my presence in the quiet moments. You will take my help when you are desperate, but you will not offer me a simple measure of respect when you are not." She looked directly at John Sullivan, and he had the grace to look away in shame. She looked at Jake Morrison, who had tried to cheat her because of her gender. "You have a great need for a doctor. You have no need for me." Without another word, she turned her back on them, climbed onto the wagon seat, and snapped the reins. She did not look back. At the telegraph office, Silas Griggs received the news of her departure. He was looking over a map of his proposed telegraph route. He listened to the operator's report, a faint, dismissive smile touching his lips. He saw her not as a person, but as a minor complication, an unpredictable variable that had now conveniently removed itself from his equation. The town, he knew, would be much easier to manage without her troublesome competence and her unsettling alliance with a Lakota man. The prairie opened up before Abigail, a vast, lonely expanse of waving grass under a sky that seemed to go on forever. The scale of it was both terrifying and liberating. Here, the petty judgments of Bitter Creek seemed insignificant, swallowed by the immense silence. The wind was a constant companion, a dry, ceaseless voice that whispered of endurance and time. It whipped stray strands of hair across her face and pushed against the canvas cover of her wagon. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to howl. Hard. White pellets began to strike the canvas. First a few, then a torrent, a hailstorm. The stones were the size of acorns, hitting the wagon with a deafening, percussive roar. Her horse whinnied in fear. Abigail pulled the wagon to a halt and scrambled into the back, huddling among her crates and bundles as the storm raged. A violent, indiscriminate fury unleashed upon the empty land. She felt impossibly small, a fragile speck at the mercy of forces far beyond her control. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air cold and clean and the ground covered in a layer of melting ice. She made a small, cold camp that night. As she ate her dry rations, she pulled her father's pocket watch from her bag. The silver was cool in her hand. The steady, quiet ticking was a comfort, a small, mechanical heartbeat in the vast wilderness. It was a piece of the world she had left behind, a world of order and science, but it was also a reminder of the legacy she carried. He had been a doctor on these same plains, facing this same solitude. The thought gave her strength. She lay wrapped in her blankets, looking up at the sky. She had never seen so many stars. Without the smoke and lamps of a town, the heavens were a spill of diamond dust, a brilliant, breathtaking tapestry that made her own struggles feel both profound and infinitesimal. She thought of Thomas, wondering if he was looking at this same sky. The fear of never seeing him again was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a new, hard-won sense of purpose. She had not been run out of town. She had chosen to leave. She was not adrift. She was on a journey. She traveled for 2 days, the landscape unchanging yet endlessly varied in its subtle shifts of light and shadow. She grew accustomed to the solitude, to the rhythm of the wagon wheels and the steady plod of her horse. She was tired, hungry, and sore, but she also felt a clean, sharp focus she had not known in months. She was no longer enduring. She was moving forward. Late on the second day, she saw it in the distance. A subtle change in the landscape. A thin line of trees that suggested a river. A sign of settlement. The Wind River Reservation. A deep, quiet relief washed over her. As she drew closer, following the rough track that served as a road, a smell reached her. Sharp and acrid on the clean air. The smell of old smoke, of charred wood. Just off the track, she saw the source. It was a corral, or what was left of one. The wooden fences were blackened stumps, the small adjoining barn a skeletal ruin of burned timbers. The ground was churned up with the tracks of shod horses, the kind ranch hands wore, not the unshod ponies favored by the Lakota. There were no animals, no people, just a scene of quiet, deliberate destruction. Abigail pulled her wagon to a stop. This was no accident. This was a message. A threat made real, Mrs. Eldridge's warning echoed in her mind. She looked from the burned corral toward the distant line of trees. She had left one fight behind in Bitter Creek, only to arrive on the doorstep of another. This one, she knew, would not be fought with whispers and sideways glances. It would be fought with fire, and it had already begun. Abigail urged her horse forward, leaving the blackened ruin of the corral behind her. The scent of smoke faded, replaced by the clean, sage-scented air of the high plains. The path led her toward a meandering line of cottonwood trees that marked the river, the lifeblood of the reservation. She saw teepees and a few small, rough-hewn cabins scattered among the trees. The settlement was quiet, watchful. Faces turned as her wagon approached, eyes following her with a curiosity that was neither friendly nor hostile, but simply observant. Children stopped their games to stare at the unfamiliar white woman in her dusty traveling dress. She did not have to ask for directions. She saw a group of men working under the hot afternoon sun, the rhythmic sound of hammers echoing in the still air. They were raising the frame of a new structure on the ashes of another burned-out building. This one a small storage barn. At the center of the activity, stripped to the waist, his skin gleaming with sweat and smudged with soot, was Thomas Running Bear. He moved with a focused intensity, lifting a heavy new beam into place. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released, a study in contained power. He did not see her at first. He was absorbed in the work, in the act of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Abigail pulled her wagon to a halt a respectful distance away and climbed down. Her legs felt stiff from the long journey. She stood for a moment, clutching the handle of her medical bag, feeling the full weight of her decision to come here. The other men noticed her first. Their hammering faltered, and they looked from her to Thomas. He followed their gaze, and his hammer fell silent. He saw her. His body went still. The heavy beam held effortlessly on his shoulder. His face, already grim, tightened. He said something in Lakota to the other men, who nodded and, after a moment, resumed their work, though their movements were now less focused, their attention divided. Thomas lowered the beam to the ground and walked toward her. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, leaving a dark streak of soot. The smell of charred wood and fresh-cut pine clung to him. He stopped a few feet from her. His eyes were dark and searching. He asked her what she was doing here. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but she could feel the question behind the question. "Why did you follow me?" She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She told him she left Bitter Creek. She said she had written a letter to the Indian agent weeks ago, applying for the post of physician. She did not know if it had arrived. She explained she had come to see for herself. He looked at her wagon, at her dusty clothes, at the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He said, "This is not Bitter Creek. The dangers here are different." He gestured with his head toward the burned timbers. This was a warning. Griggs wants this land. He wants a clear path for his telegraph line. He will not be gentle about getting it. Abigail looked from the ruin to his face. She replied that she was not looking for a gentle place. She was looking for a place to do her work, a place where she was needed. A wave of emotion, sudden and overwhelming, rose up in her. It was the exhaustion of the journey, the stark reality of the violence that had greeted her, the raw, unspoken feeling that pulsed between her and this man. It was too much. The carefully constructed walls of her professionalism, of her fierce independence, began to crumble. She saw a future of constant struggle, of being an outsider in yet another place, of endangering this man just by being near him. The thought was unbearable. She turned away, a sharp, involuntary movement. She took a step back toward her wagon, her only thought to flee, to put distance between herself and the impossible weight of it all. It was the same instinct that had made her build walls around her heart in Chicago, the same instinct that had almost kept her from leaving the hollow security of Bitter Creek. A hand closed around her wrist. It was not rough, but it was absolute. He pulled her, not with anger, but with an undeniable certainty, spinning her back to face him. He drew her close, so close that the front of her dress brushed against his bare chest, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He placed his other hand on the small of her back, a steadying, grounding pressure. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. She closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. Through the soles of her worn boots, she could feel the solid earth. In the distance, she could hear the faint, musical sound of children laughing at their play, a sound of life in the midst of ruin. The prairie wind whispered through the new timbers of the rising barn, a sound of rebuilding. "Stop running from me." She heard Brave Warrior caught her and showed why her heart surrendered. The words were a low murmur, a vibration that traveled from his chest to hers. It was not a command, but a plea. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had been fleeing her entire life, the vulnerability of connection, the risk of belonging. the terrifying, beautiful surrender of being truly seen by another person. In that moment, pressed against him, with the scent of smoke and sweat and pine filling her senses, the fight went out of her. The frantic need for distance dissolved, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of arrival. She had not been running toward the reservation. She had been running toward him, and now she was home. She opened her eyes. His were inches from hers, dark and intense, holding a universe of shared understanding. He did not kiss her. The moment was too fragile, too profound for that. It was an allegiance, a silent vow made in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness. After a long moment, he released her wrist and stepped back. Though his hand remained on her back, the intensity of the moment softened, replaced by a quiet, shared purpose. He said the people here need a doctor. My people. He looked at the half-built barn. That was our storehouse. We will build it again. We will build your clinic beside it. The simplicity of his words was a balm. He was not just accepting her presence. He was integrating it into the fabric of his community, into the very act of rebuilding. He was making a space for her, not as an outsider, but as a part of the whole. Abigail nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes," she said, "that is what we will do." They stood together, a plan forming between them, a blueprint for a future that was uncertain and fraught with danger, but would be faced together. They would live here, openly. There would be no more hiding, no more whispered rumors in the shadows. Their partnership, forged in the crises of Bitter Creek, would now be the foundation of their life here. As they spoke, an older man approached, his face a testament to a long life, his eyes holding a deep, weary wisdom. He was one of the tribal elders. He looked at Abigail, his gaze lingering on her white skin, and then he spoke to Thomas in Lakota. Thomas listened, his expression serious, and replied in the same tongue. When the elder had walked away, Abigail asked what he had said. Thomas looked out over the land. He said that some of the elders are wary. They have seen many white people come to this land. Most of them came to take, not to give. He paused. They will need to see your heart before they can trust your hands. Abigail understood. Respect here would not be given because of a piece of paper from a Chicago medical school. It would have to be earned, day by day, act by act. It was a new kind of challenge, one she was ready to meet. Just then, a rider galloped into the settlement, his horse lathered with sweat. He was a young Lakota man who served as a scout. He slid from his horse and spoke urgently to Thomas, his words sharp with alarm. Thomas's face hardened. He turned to Abigail. The brief peace of their reunion shattered. That was a message from one of our scouts watching the trail from Bitter Creek. He said, Silas Griggs's survey team has been spotted. They are making camp 10 miles from the Sacred Valley. They will begin their work by the end of the week. The threat was no longer a distant rumble. It was here, at their doorstep. The fight for this land, for this new life they had just begun to imagine, was about to begin. The small building rose from the ashes of the old storehouse, its new pine boards smelling of resilience. Inside, Abigail had created a sanctuary of science and order. She had whitewashed the walls until they were a brilliant, clean white, a stark contrast to the endless dusty brown of the prairie. Her examination table, her neatly arranged glass bottles of carbolic acid and iodine, and her carefully sterilized instruments all gleamed in the Wyoming sunlight that streamed through the 2 new windows. This small, white room was her world, a bastion of logic and healing set down in the heart of another, older world of spirits and tradition. The Lakota people came to her slowly, cautiously. At first, it was the children, brought by their mothers with scraped knees or persistent coughs. They watched her with wide, dark eyes as she treated them with a gentle efficiency that was both foreign and comforting. Then the women began to come, with the aches and ailments of hard lives. They were hesitant to speak of their pains, But Abigail learned to read the stories in their tired faces and weary posture. The men held back the longest, their pride a formidable barrier. But after she successfully treated a nasty gash on a young hunter's leg, preventing the infection that would have crippled him, a few began to appear at her door. Their injuries presented with a gruff shyness, while Abigail built her fortress of healing. Thomas worked to shore up the fragile peace. He had been asked to serve with a small group of men who acted as the reservation's tribal police. His work was not one of violence, but of mediation. He rode the borders of the reservation, a territory whose lines were constantly being disputed by the cattle ranchers who leased the surrounding land. He would find a rancher's fence cut and listen to accusations that it was Lakota boys looking for trouble. He would then find the Lakota boys and listen to their claims that the rancher's cattle were straying onto their hunting grounds, spooking the game. He moved between these two suspicious worlds, his voice always calm, his judgment always fair, seeking a balance that seemed to shift and crumble as soon as he found it. One afternoon, an old woman entered the clinic. Her face was a beautiful web of wrinkles, and she carried herself with an authority that needed no announcement. She introduced herself as Singing Crow, the sister of Thomas's mother. She had not come for medicine. She had come to see. She watched Abigail grind herbs with a mortar and pestle, her movements economical and precise. She observed as Abigail spoke gently to a young mother, explaining how to make a poultice for her baby's chest. Finally, Singing Crow spoke. She said that her sister had also been a healer. She used the plants that the Creator gave to the people. Her medicine was for the spirit as well as the body. She looked at Abigail's rows of glass bottles. "Your medicine," she said, "is powerful, but it is loud. It does not whisper to the body. It shouts." Abigail stopped her work. She replied that she wished her medicine could whisper. She said that sometimes. The body is so sick, it can no longer hear whispers. Sometimes, it needs a shout to wake it from the edge of the long sleep. A slow smile spread across Singing Crow's face. She reached into a small bag she carried and produced a pair of moccasins. They were made of soft, smoked deer hide and decorated with intricate beadwork. The pattern a complex, beautiful design of blue and white flowers. She held them out to Abigail. "These were made for you." She said, "A woman who walks a hard path should have soft shoes." Abigail's throat tightened. She took the moccasins, the leather warm and supple in her hands. She understood the weight of the gift. It was more than a pair of shoes. It was a bridge. It was acceptance. She looked at Singing Crow, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely a whisper. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. The news came first. A rumor carried on the wind that Silas Griggs's survey team was not just plotting a path, but driving stakes into the ground, marking a route that cut directly through the valley of the sleeping ancestors, the tribe's most sacred burial ground. Anger simmered through the camp. The blatant disrespect was an open wound. Then came the second blow. A rancher named Henderson, whose land bordered the reservation, rode into Bitter Creek, claiming the Lakota were poisoning his cattle. 2 of his best heifers had been found dead near a well close to the reservation line. By the next day, 3 more were dead. The ranchers, already on edge, seized on the story. It confirmed their deepest suspicions. The Lakota were thieves and saboteurs. A mob of angry men gathered in Bitter Creek, their talk turning ugly. The official complaint was brought to the reservation by the new Indian agent, a man named Arthur Bennett. He was a young man from the East, his face earnest and his manner blessedly free of the usual condescending arrogance. He met with the tribal elders, with Thomas and Abigail present. He explained the situation, his own frustration with the ranchers' rush to judgment clear in his voice. But the cattle were dead, and the ranchers were demanding action. Thomas spoke, his voice low and steady. He said his people did not poison wells. It is the act of a coward who poisons the water that gives life. He said it was more likely the cattle were sick. Agent Bennett sighed. That is what I told them. But they will not listen to reason. They want someone to blame. Abigail had been listening quietly. Now she spoke. "There is a way to find the truth," she said. "If Mr. Henderson will permit it, I can examine one of the dead animals. A body holds its own secrets. I can make it speak." The idea was met with stunned silence. Bennett looked at her, intrigued. The elders murmured among themselves. Singing Crow, who was also present, looked at Abigail with a new, sharp interest. It took 2 days of tense negotiation, mediated by Bennett, but the desperate rancher finally, reluctantly, agreed. He did not believe it would do any good, but he was losing money with every animal that died, and he was willing to try anything. Abigail went to the Henderson ranch. Thomas went with her. A group of grim-faced ranchers stood watching, their arms crossed, their eyes full of hostility. The dead heifer lay near the well, its body already bloated under the hot sun. The air was thick with the smell of death. Abigail laid out a canvas sheet with her instruments. She was a doctor of human beings, but the principles of anatomy and pathology were universal. She worked for over an hour, her focus absolute, shutting out the murmuring of the ranchers and the oppressive heat. Thomas stood beside her, a silent, unmovable presence, handing her tools and clean cloths. She examined the animal's stomach contents. She looked at the state of its internal organs, and then she found it. The lining of the stomach was inflamed, with a telltale reddish appearance, like brick dust. She had seen drawings of it in her toxicology textbooks. It was a classic sign of arsenic poisoning. She stood up, wiping her hands. She looked at Henderson, and then at the other ranchers. "Your cattle are not sick," she said. "They are being poisoned." A grim satisfaction spread across Henderson's face. "I told you," he snarled, looking toward the reservation. "But not by a man," Abigail continued, her voice cutting through his anger. She pointed to a small, muddy creek that trickled down from the hills behind the ranch, feeding the well from which the cattle drank. She asked Henderson where that creek came from. He grumbled that it was just runoff from the hills. She then asked if it was not true that Silas Griggs had reopened an old silver mine up in those same hills a few months ago. A flicker of understanding, and then dawning horror, appeared on the rancher's face. The process of extracting silver often involved arsenic. The mine's tailings, the waste rock, would be full of it. The spring rains would have washed that poison down the hillside, into the creek, and directly into his well. His own cattle were drinking from a poisoned source created by the very man who was fanning the flames of their anger. Abigail presented her findings to Agent Bennett that evening. With Thomas at her side, she had taken samples from the well water and, using a simple chemical test, had confirmed the presence of arsenic. The proof was irrefutable. It was not the Lakota. It was Silas Griggs, whose careless greed was poisoning the land. Bennett now had the evidence he needed to file a formal complaint, to challenge Griggs's entire operation on a legal footing. For the first time, they had a weapon to fight back. Their victory was short-lived. The next afternoon, a carriage, black and polished and utterly out of place, rolled into the reservation, pulled by 2 magnificent black horses. It stopped in the center of the settlement. Silas Griggs himself stepped out. He was dressed impeccably, his boots polished to a high shine. He moved with the unshakable confidence of a king surveying his domain. He did not raise his voice or make threats. He simply approached Agent Bennett, who had come out to meet him, and handed him a folded document tied with a ribbon. It bore the official seal of the United States Department of the Interior. "It is a federal permit," Griggs announced, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "It grants my company full right-of-way to construct a telegraph line through this territory, by the most direct route possible." He smiled, a thin, cold expression. "Your complaints about my mining operation are irrelevant. The priorities of the nation, Mr. Bennett, supersede the concerns of a few dying cows and a few sentimental Indians. His gaze swept over the assembled Lakota, and then settled, for a brief, chilling moment, on Abigail. Silas Griggs' federal permit hung over the reservation like a thunderhead, a legal document that felt more violent than a loaded gun. His survey team, emboldened, began working more aggressively, driving their stakes deeper into the sacred valley. The Lakota watched, their anger a palpable force, held in check only by the counsel of their elders and the tireless efforts of Thomas, who urged patience, insisting that Agent Bennett was still fighting for them through legal channels. But the air grew thicker with every passing day, charged with the promise of a coming storm, both metaphorical and real. The storm that finally broke was a monster. It rolled in from the north, a wall of dark, churning cloud that swallowed the late afternoon sun and plunged the prairie into an eerie twilight. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a freight train roar, tearing at the canvas of the teepees and threatening to rip the sod roofs from the cabins. Then came the rain. It was not a cleansing rain, but a brutal, punishing deluge, hitting the hard-packed earth with such force that it bounced, turning the ground into a churning brown sea. The river, normally a placid, life-giving ribbon of water, began to swell. It crept up its banks, then surged, a muddy, debris-choked torrent that clawed at the edges of the settlement. Panic, cold and swift, set in. Families scrambled to move their belongings to higher ground, their shouts lost in the howl of the wind. Griggs's men had strung a temporary telegraph line through the valley, a thin iron wire that was a prelude to the permanent cable. In the heart of the storm, one of the hastily erected poles, its foundations loosened by the flash flood, gave way. With a crack like a rifle shot, it fell, pulling the wire and the next pole down with it. The heavy pole, a massive, creosote-soaked log, crashed directly into a cluster of teepees on the low ground near the river, where several families had been unable to evacuate in time. The sound of splintering lodge poles and the screams of the injured were a new, terrible note in the symphony of the storm. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas and Abigail ran toward the disaster. The scene was chaos. The heavy pole had crushed one teepee completely, and the iron wire, tangled and lethal, was wrapped around the wreckage of others. People were trapped, injured, crying out in the darkness. Abigail's clinic was on higher ground and safe. For the moment, she and Thomas organized a rescue effort, their voices cutting through the panic. Thomas, with a strength that seemed superhuman, began lifting the pole, shouting for other men to help, to use levers, to free those trapped beneath. Abigail moved from one injured person to another, her medical bag a shield against the driving rain. Her hands, illuminated by the bobbing light of a few precious lanterns, worked swiftly, triaging the wounded, staunching bleeding, setting a broken arm with makeshift splints. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her to the bone, but she did not seem to notice. Her world had once again narrowed to the immediate, desperate need in front of her. They worked through the night, a small, determined band fighting against the fury of the storm. The division between white doctor and Lakota patient dissolved, washed away by the common current of suffering and survival. They were simply people, working together to save their own. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to bruise the eastern sky, and the storm finally seemed to be losing its strength, a new horror erupted. A cry of fire went up from the center of the camp. Abigail's head snapped up. The cry was coming from the direction of her clinic. She ran, her heart seizing with a cold dread. The clinic, her white-walled sanctuary, was engulfed in flames. The fire was unnaturally fierce, feeding on something more than just the dry pine boards. The rain, which should have suppressed it, seemed to have no effect. An ugly, chemical smell hung in the air. As she stared in disbelief, a woman shrieked a name. Little Hawk. He was a boy of about 7, the son of one of the women Abigail had treated. He had been sleeping on a cot in the back of the clinic, recovering from a bad fever. In the chaos of the flood, he had been forgotten. He was still inside. Thomas was beside her. Before Abigail could even form a thought, he was moving. He grabbed a wet horse blanket from a nearby line and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. He did not shout or call for help. He simply ran, a dark, determined shape, and plunged directly into the roaring heart of the fire. The seconds that followed were an eternity. The building groaned, the main roof beam threatening to give way. The heat was so intense it drove the onlookers back. Abigail stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, her throat raw from a scream that would not come out. Then he emerged from the flames. He was staggering, half-blinded, the blanket smoldering on his back. In his arms, he carried the small, limp form of the boy. He took a few steps onto the muddy ground and collapsed to his knees, coughing, his body racked with tremors. Abigail was at his side in an instant. Little Hawk was unconscious, but he was breathing. She ripped away the boy's shirt, checking for burns. Thomas had managed to shield him with his own body. He was safe. But Thomas was not. The blanket had slipped during the rescue, and the entire back of his left shoulder and arm was a mass of angry, weeping burns. The pain must have been excruciating, but his face was a mask of grim determination. He looked past his own injury, his eyes fixed on the boy, asking if he was all right. Abigail's training took over, a cold, clear wave of purpose washing away her terror. Here in the mud and the driving rain, with the ruins of her clinic burning behind them, she went to work. She sent someone for the clean linen and burn salves she kept in a secondary kit in her wagon. She cleaned Thomas's wounds as gently as she could, the rain mixing with the water from her basin. He did not flinch, though she could see the muscles in his jaw bunching with the effort to control the pain. As she worked, she could feel the eyes of the entire community on them. They saw her, their white doctor, tending to the man who had just offered his life for one of their children. And they saw him, Thomas Running Bear, not as a man who walked between two worlds, but as a warrior who belonged wholly and completely to them. As the sun rose higher, the rain finally stopped. The fire in the clinic burned itself out, leaving a blackened, steaming skeleton in the muddy ground near the back wall, where the fire had started. A young man found something. It was a small, twisted piece of metal, part of a blasting cap, the kind used in mining, and a few feet away, snagged on a nail, was a small scrap of canvas, a piece of a work coat. Stamped on it in faded black ink was a small logo, the unmistakable brand of the Griggs Cattle Company. The evidence was clear. The fire had not been an accident of the storm. It had been deliberately set with an accelerant, an act of calculated violence designed to destroy their only source of medical care. It was an escalation, a move from legal intimidation to outright war. Later that day, Agent Bennett returned from a frantic, all-night ride. He looked exhausted, but his eyes held a spark of something new, righteous fury. He had been to the Territorial Records Office. He had spent hours poring over old survey maps and land grants. And he had found it, the original, official map for the telegraph right-of-way, the one that had been signed and sealed years ago. He unrolled it on a table for Thomas and Abigail to see. The legal route, he explained, his finger tracing a line on the old paper, did not go through the Sacred Valley at all. It was routed 2 miles to the north, through a rocky but unoccupied stretch of land. The federal permit Silas Griggs had brandished was real, but the map he was using, the one his surveyors were staking out, was a forgery. He had altered the documents, counting on the fact that no one would have the resources or the will to check the original records. Abigail looked from the map to Thomas's bandaged shoulder. The storm had washed away the dirt and grime, revealing the ugly truth of Silas Griggs's greed. But it had also revealed their own strength, their own resilience. The fire had taken her clinic, but it had forged something stronger in its place, a community united by loss, and a resolve as hard and unyielding as steel. The evidence lay on a rough-hewn table in the center of the largest teepee, that of the elders. There was Agent Bennett's certified copy of the original map, its crisp lines a stark indictment of the forgery Silas Griggs carried. There was Abigail's meticulously detailed report on the arsenic poisoning, complete with preserved samples of the tainted water and soil. And there was the small, damning collection of items from the fire, the twisted metal of the blasting cap, and the scrap of canvas with the Griggs Company brand. It was an arsenal of truth, more powerful than any collection of rifles. The plan was forged in the quiet council of the elders, with Bennett, Thomas, and Abigail. Bennett, his face set with a grim determination, would ride for Cheyenne immediately, with the evidence of federal mail fraud, forgery, and arson. He could secure warrants and the backing of the United States Marshals. It would take him at least 2 days of hard riding, 1 day there and 1 day back. In that time, Griggs' crew, already camped at the mouth of Bitter Fork Canyon, would begin their work. They could not be allowed to desecrate the burial grounds. Thomas would lead the tribal police to the canyon. It would not be a war party. They would carry rifles, as was their right on their own land. But they would be symbols of authority, not aggression. Their purpose was to block the path, to create a physical and legal barrier. Abigail insisted on going with them. Bennett argued against it, calling it too dangerous, but she was resolute. "My evidence is not just words on a page," she said. "The ranchers and workers know me. They have seen my work. My testimony, delivered in person, is a weapon you do not have." Thomas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not protest, but a deep, quiet understanding. He knew her steel. He nodded his assent. They rode out at dawn, a small, somber procession under a vast, pale sky. Thomas, his bandaged shoulder a stark white against his dark shirt, rode at the head of a dozen men. Abigail rode beside him on a steady mare, her medical bag tied securely to the saddle. She was not dressed as a doctor, but as a woman of the plains, in a sturdy riding skirt and a simple blouse, the gifted moccasins soft and sure on her feet. They reached Bitter Fork Canyon as the morning sun was clearing the horizon. It was a natural choke point, a narrow passage carved through ancient rock, the only way for wagons to get through to the sacred valley. Griggs's crew was already at work, unloading equipment from a large wagon. The foreman, a hard-faced man named Calloway, shouted orders, and standing by a small fire, sipping coffee from a tin cup, was Silas Griggs himself. He looked relaxed, confident, the absolute master of his domain. His confidence wavered when he saw them. He watched as Thomas and his men fanned out, forming a silent, impassable line across the mouth of the canyon. He saw Abigail, astride her horse, her face calm and determined. His eyes narrowed, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He strode forward, his foreman and a half-dozen rough-looking men falling into step behind him. He stopped 20 yards from their line. He demanded to know what this was. He called it an unlawful obstruction. He held up his own version of the map, the fraudulent permit waving in the morning breeze. He told them he had the full authority of the federal government. Thomas dismounted, handing his reins to a young rider. He walked forward alone. Stopping 10 feet from Griggs, he did not shout. His voice was calm, carrying easily in the clear, still air. He said, "This is Lakota land. The paper you hold is a lie. Your route does not belong here." Griggs laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A lie. My engineers surveyed this route. It is the most direct path. It is the path I will take." Abigail dismounted and walked to stand beside Thomas. She looked not at Griggs, but at the workers, at the nervous ranch hands he had hired for security. Some of these men she recognized. She had treated one for a broken finger, another for a bad cough. She held up the small glass vial containing the well water from the Henderson ranch. She said, "This is the water your families drink, that your cattle drink. She said Silas Griggs told you the Lakota poisoned it. That was a lie. This water is poisoned with arsenic, runoff from his silver mine in the hills. He knew it, and he let you believe a lie that could have started a war, all to cover his own carelessness. A murmur went through Griggs's men. Henderson's story was well known. Then Thomas spoke again, this time in Lakota, his voice rising with a formal, powerful cadence. He spoke to his own men, but also to the spirit of the land itself. He spoke of the ancestors who slept in the valley, of the sacred trust they held to protect them. He was not just a peacekeeper now. He was a leader, a voice for his people, grounding their stand in a tradition that was far older than any federal permit. Then he switched back to English. He looked at Calloway, the foreman. He told him the clinic on the reservation was burned. An act of arson, designed to leave women and children without a doctor. We found this at the scene. He held up the scrap of canvas with the company logo. Calloway's face went pale. Griggs's hired guns shifted their weight, their hands hovering near the pistols at their hips. The simple truth, presented calmly and clearly, was unraveling their certainty, leaving only the raw, ugly greed at the center of their purpose. Griggs saw he was losing control, his face contorted with rage. He shouted that he was tired of this. He told his men to clear the path. He screamed that he would pay a bonus to the first man who put a bullet in the half-breed. The world seemed to explode in a sudden, sharp report. One of the hired guns, his nerves shot, had drawn his pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but it broke the spell. The canyon erupted with the chaotic noise of gunfire. It was not a disciplined battle, but a frantic, ugly scramble. Men on both sides dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind rocks and wagons. A bullet kicked up dust near Thomas's feet, and he felt a searing, white-hot line of pain across his ribs. The shot had only grazed him, tearing through his shirt and skin, but the impact staggered him. He fell to one knee, grabbing his side. Abigail rushed to his side, her medical training overriding any sense of fear. She was focused only on the wound. From behind the cover of his wagon, Silas Griggs saw his moment. His entire plan was collapsing, exposed by this stubborn woman and the man who stood with her. His empire of lies was crumbling to dust. All his rage, all his frustration, coalesced into a single, murderous point. He raised his own pistol, taking careful aim, not at the wounded Thomas, but at Abigail as she knelt over him. Thomas saw the movement. He saw the cold, reptilian focus in Griggs's eyes. He did not have time to think. He lunged, shoving Abigail hard, throwing her to the ground behind him as the gun fired. He felt the bullet slam into his already wounded shoulder, the one that had been burned. The force of it spun him around, and he fell heavily, the world dissolving into a gray, roaring haze. The sound of hoofbeats, a thunderous drumming rhythm, filled the canyon. Agent Bennett, his face grim, rode at the head of a posse of 6 federal marshals, their long dusters flapping, their rifles held at the ready. They had made better time than anyone could have hoped. Their sudden appearance, a vision of absolute federal authority, shattered the remaining will of Griggs's men. They threw down their weapons, their hands rising in surrender. The short, brutal fight was over. 2 marshals hauled Silas Griggs out from behind the wagon. His face was a mask of disbelief, his fine coat torn and smeared with dirt. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a petty, snarling rage. Bennett stood before him, the original map in one hand and the arrest warrants in the other. "Silas Griggs," he said, his voice ringing with the clear, cold tone of justice. "You are under arrest for arson, for the willful poisoning of a water source, for conspiracy, and for fraud against the United States government." As the marshals led him away in irons, Griggs looked at Abigail, who was now desperately tending to Thomas's wounds. His face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated hate. The news of the arrest and Griggs's crimes traveled down the humming telegraph wire he had so desperately wanted to build. In Bitter Creek, The reaction was stunned silence, followed by a deep, collective shame. They had been manipulated, their own prejudices used as a weapon against them by a man they had trusted. 2 days later, a wagon arrived at the reservation. It was not carrying surveyors or hired guns. It was driven by Jake Morrison. In the back were crates of medical supplies, bandages, carbolic acid, and quinine, all purchased by a collection taken up in the town. Mrs. Eldridge had sent a package of her finest herbal remedies. It was a humble offering, an unspoken apology. That evening, as Abigail was changing the dressing on Thomas's shoulder, a young boy brought a telegraph message for her. It was from Mrs. Eldridge. The message was short. It said that the town council of Bitter Creek, along with the ranchers in the surrounding territory, had voted to create a new position, regional medical consultant. The job was to advise on public health matters and to be on call for severe emergencies. The position, the telegram concluded, was offered to Dr. Abigail Dawson. It would not require her to leave her current post at the Wind River Reservation. She could have both worlds, not as a woman caught between them, but as a bridge that connected them. The Wyoming winter came and went, a long, hard season of snow and silence that gave the land and its people time to heal. Thomas's shoulder mended, leaving a puckered, angry scar that was a permanent reminder of the fire, but also of his own strength. The bullet graze on his ribs faded to a thin white line. He moved with his old, easy grace, but with a new quiet authority in his eyes. He had been tested by fire and had emerged not hardened, but tempered. With the spring thaw, a new energy filled the reservation. The burned-out skeleton of the clinic was cleared away, not by a few hired hands, but by the entire community. Men who had once looked at Abigail with suspicion now worked side by side, sawing new timbers and raising new walls. The women brought food and drink, their initial wariness replaced by a fierce, protective pride. The supplies from Bitter Creek were integrated with lumber from the reservation's own small mill. The new clinic was twice as large as the old one, with a small adjoining room that would serve as a proper infirmary. It was not her clinic anymore. It was theirs. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was held on a bright afternoon in late spring, under the open sky, with the cottonwood trees rustling their new green leaves. There was no pastor in a black coat, no rigid rows of pews. Agent Bennett attended, a formal witness from the world of government. But the true officiants were the elders of the tribe and the land itself. Singing Crow stood with Abigail, her presence a quiet, powerful blessing. Thomas's friends from the tribal police stood with him. Abigail did not wear a white dress from Chicago. She wore a simple doeskin dress, a gift from the women of the tribe, and on her feet were the moccasins Singing Crow had given her, the soft leather already molded to the shape of her feet. Thomas wore his finest beaded vest over a simple linen shirt. They did not exchange rings, instead, in a Lakota tradition. Their wrists were bound together with a single strip of braided sweetgrass, symbolizing their two lives becoming one. They drank from the same cup and shared the same piece of bread, a simple communion that blended two worlds into one promise. It was a union not of spectacle, but of profound, quiet truth. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. That summer, consumption, the white plague that haunted so many, took a young mother, leaving behind a small, silent girl of 5 named Lily. The child had no other family. She was lost, a ghost in her own home, without discussion, without formal decision. Abigail and Thomas brought her into theirs. Abigail tended to the lingering cough the child carried, building up her strength with good food and care. Thomas taught her the names of the prairie flowers and carved her a small wooden horse that fit perfectly in her hand. Slowly, the light returned to the little girl's eyes. Their small cabin, once a place for 2 solitary people, was now a home, filled with the small sounds of a child learning to laugh again. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, Abigail knew she was pregnant with their first child. 5 years passed. The raw newness of the settlement softened, settling into the landscape as if it had always been there. The house Abigail and Thomas had built, a sturdy log cabin with a wide wooden porch, now had the comfortable, lived-in feel of a place where life was happening. One clear, cool evening, Thomas sat on the porch steps with his son, Samuel, a sturdy 4-year-old with his mother's steady gray eyes and his father's black hair. In his other arm, he held Lily, now a bright, healthy girl of 10. He was pointing up at the deepening twilight sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "That one," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "is the Great Bear, but my people call it the Sacred Hoop. It is the circle of our nation, with no beginning and no end." He traced the constellation with his finger, telling the children the old stories, the legends that were written in the sky, a map of belonging that stretched back through time. Abigail stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching them. A deep, quiet contentment filled her, so profound it was almost a physical presence. The fierce, armored woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Bitter Creek felt like a person from another lifetime. She had come west seeking the freedom to practice her profession, to be a doctor on her own terms. She had found that, but she had also found something far greater, the freedom to be herself, to love and be loved, to build a home not just for her body, but for her soul. The quiet of the evening was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching. It was a young rider from the agency office, carrying a telegraph message. He handed it to Abigail with a respectful nod. Telegraph still felt like an intrusion to her, a jangling wire from a world she had mostly left behind. She opened it under the light of the lamp from the doorway. It was not from Mrs. Eldridge or from Bitter Creek. The message was from the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. He had received a copy of her report on the arsenic poisoning, forwarded to him by a colleague of Agent Bennett. The editor was deeply impressed by her forensic methods and her clear, scientific conclusions. The message was a formal invitation to publish her findings, to share her work on the chemical analysis of water sources with the wider medical community. She read it twice, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was not a smile of triumph, but of quiet, profound satisfaction. The world she had been forced to leave, the world that had tried to confine her, was now reaching out, not to offer her a place within its rigid structure, but to ask for her knowledge. Her voice, her expertise, was now sought after. A thread of scientific truth stretching from this remote reservation all the way back to the heart of Boston. A letter had arrived from Bitter Creek just last week. A mild sickness had swept through the town, and their new, young doctor was overwhelmed. They had not demanded her help. They had written to ask for her advice, her consultation. Thomas had gone with her. They had spent 2 days there, not as outcasts, but as respected neighbors. The relationship was new, fragile, but built now on a foundation of mutual respect. The town had learned a hard lesson in humility, and in doing so, had found a way to heal itself. She looked up from the telegram at her family, bathed in the soft golden light from the cabin. Lily was braiding a piece of grass, and Samuel was leaning his head against his father's good shoulder, his eyes wide with wonder at the star stories. This was her world. This was the home they had built, not with just wood and nails, but with courage, with truth, and with a love that was as steady and sure as the northern star. The West was still a wild and difficult place, but she had learned that it was not a place to be conquered. It was a place to belong. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.